Hey there, class. Today we're going to talk a little bit about short field takeoff and climb. First things first, why do we do a short field takeoff and climb? What is a short field takeoff and climb? Basically, a short field takeoff allows us to climb the greatest amount of altitude in the shortest amount of distance. This helps us when we're taking off of these shorter runways or we're taking off with these higher performance aircraft. Us, with our 10,000 foot runway and our little aircrafts, don't need to worry about this too much at the moment. But with us starting to go to these smaller airports and once we graduate, potentially using these higher powered aircraft, we will most likely have to use this takeoff a lot more than we do now. And so basically, this helps us clear any obstacles or things that could be off the end of the runway that could give us any problems, so to say. So let's say this is our runway, right? It's going this way right now. This is our 10,000 foot runway. You know, we take off, we climb, we don't really have too many things bothering us. But now, let's say the runway, this is like Mach or Tutu or something. We'll say these are all trees, right? Right at the end of the runway. Let's say your normal takeoff is just gonna put you right into these trees. How do we take off of this runway? Yeah, maybe you could go this way, but maybe there's just a giant peak or a hill right there. So what we do is we climb at a lower airspeed, which slows our movement forward and keeps us going higher, quicker, so to say. So the way this works is how we set up for this takeoff is our POH we set our flaps at 10 degrees so we can take off a little sooner, climb a little quicker. We don't have to be at such a quick airspeed to get off the ground, to just start taking off. So we take off at 55. You climb at 65, our VX, our greatest distance to climb. And then we climb at VX until we are above our obstacles, you know. In training, we use 50 feet. So once you take off and you are above your obstacles at 65, you level out a little bit and get to 75, our VY, our greatest time to climb, the quickest we can get altitude. And then that's the end of the takeoff, so to say. But with these short field takeoffs, there's another aspect that plays in, and that's just the field length, the aborted takeoff. Do we have enough runway to even get off the ground? And David Perry taught us a little rule of thumb trick. Halfway down the runway, if you are not at 75% of your takeoff speed, then abort the takeoff. So for math reasons, let's say our takeoff speed is 60 instead of 55. So you break 60 into fourths, right? What's 75% of 60? 45. So if you're not halfway down the runway at 45 knots already, then you should abort your takeoff. And I'm saying 75. Perry said it was like 70.5, but I'm not gonna know 70% of a random number, you know. 75% is a little more on the safe side. It's easier to compute. It helps. So once you get up in the air, you're above your obstacles, you still have 10 degrees of flaps in. What you do is you level out the plane, you get to 75, positive climb, flaps up. And then you just continue 75, and then you continue your climb to your whichever altitude you decide you're going to. And that is basically short field takeoff and climb. It talks about aborted takeoff, what to do in that situation, how to determine when to use it. And then I brought up the ACS standards for short field takeoff and maximum performance climb to determine the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with short field takeoff, maximum performance climb operations, and rejected takeoff procedures. And that's why I brought up aborted takeoff. But it talks about how you climb with VX and VY and appropriate airplane configuration. So you gotta make sure you set up the plane correctly before you can even begin the maneuver. But then it goes into risk management, right? It talks about our crosswind, our wind shear, tailwind maybe. You gotta be aware of what affects your takeoff, when you're taking off, and how you're taking off. As I said that word too much that time, but basically, if we're taking off 1-1 and wind is, let's say, 2-9, right? Direct tailwind. We're gonna have a longer takeoff distance, so we will be more inclined to use a short field takeoff because we may not have the required distance to be able to take off. And this kind of goes into, it all just ties together. It's basically, you want to take off as safe as possible, and the short field takeoff allows you to take off in the shortest distance possible. And with an aircraft, being on the ground is kind of the more dangerous. I wouldn't say dangerous. Maybe dangerous isn't the right word, but it's a lot more chaotic, I would say, near the ground, because there's so much more things that can go on and that are going on when you're on the ground. It's like in the air, most of the time, there's not too many people around. You're pretty relatively lenient, you're just out there flying, right? With on the ground, it's got to be a lot more precise. You can't go where where you haven't been cleared to go, and you got to be cleared to go places before you can start to go there. But when you're in the air, it's not the same. You guys know we're all commercial pilots here. But ACS, right? It goes into skills as well, which is basically the allowances this maneuver allows you to have, right? So as for any takeoff, you got to clear the area when you're taxiing and before you taxi onto the runway for takeoff. You got to check both approach and departure sides, make sure there's no aircraft, either coming in for landing or still on the runway or coming towards you on the runway. But once you do that, you make sure it's the runway you're supposed to take off, has the same numbers as it's supposed to, And then for the short field, we usually don't do this because it's 10,000 feet, but we line up as far back as we're allowed to. As much of the runway as we can, we want to use, right? We'll hold the brakes. We'll apply full throttle. We'll wait for the RPMs to settle, make sure everything's green, and we'll release the brakes, right? You start hurtling down the runway. Airspeed comes alive, all the instruments are green, lift off at 55, climb at 65, above 50 feet, above your obstacles, flaps up, climb at 75. And that's pretty simple, You want to Rotate and lift off recommended airspeed and accelerated to the recommended obstacle clearance airspeed, or VX, plus or minus 5 knots. That's the allowance there. Pitch attitude that will maintain recommended obstacle clearance airspeed, or VX, plus or minus 5 knots until the obstacle is cleared or until the airplane is 50 feet above the ground. Establish the pitch attitude for VY and accelerate to VY, plus or minus 5 knots after clearing the obstacle at 50 feet AGL or simulating an obstacle. Whew. All right. And then it's configure the airplane in accordance with the manufacturer's guidance after a positive rate of climb has been verified. So that's the flaps up in increments that we use. And then maintain VY plus or minus 5 knots to a safe maneuvering altitude. So your DP, he'll tell you, takeoff, or short field takeoff, climb to whatever. If you're staying in the pattern, it'll just be traffic pattern altitude. If you're leaving the pattern, he'll tell you an altitude. And you'll climb to that altitude because that's what he wants to see, And so you got to maintain directional control, and it's going to be a little more difficult than normal takeoffs as you are flying at a slower airspeed. So you got to be a little more aware of the winds if you're getting pushed, or if you're getting pushed around, and that is about all I know about short field takeoffs.